At a townhouse on the Upper East Side, a woman in her 50s opens the door not for her daughter's therapist, but for a Latin tutor who charges $400 an hour and has a 2-year waiting list. The therapist's card sits in a drawer somewhere, unused, replaced by a name that circulates quietly between mothers who would never admit they compare notes. This is not an isolated preference. Across the old money enclaves of Manhattan, Greenwich, and the Hamptons, a subtle substitution has been happening for the better part of 2 years. And it has almost nothing to do with denying that a child struggles, and everything to do with what these families believe actually repairs one. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel unpacks the unspoken codes of old money. The habits, the instincts, the quiet decisions that never make it into a magazine profile. If that's the kind of world you want to understand better, subscribe. Ask someone from New Money why their teenager sees a therapist twice a week, and the answer tends to be about mental health, about processing, about feelings finally being given language. Ask someone from Old Money why their teenager instead sees a Greek tutor, a debate coach, or a chess master flown in for a single weekend, and the answer comes back almost defiant in its simplicity. Because mastery is the medicine, not talk, not excavation, mastery. There's a particular quiet that settles over a dinner table in Milan when a child's difficulties come up in conversation. Nobody uses the word struggling. Someone mentions instead that the boy has found his footing since he started with his tutor, and the table nods, satisfied, because footing implies ground beneath the feet, a problem already being solved through structure rather than one still being spoken about in a therapist's office. This isn't coldness, though it can look that way from the outside. It's a philosophy passed down so quietly that most of the families living by it couldn't articulate it if you asked them directly. It says something like this: a mind in crisis is not a mind to be interrogated. It's a mind to be occupied with something difficult enough to demand total concentration, precise enough to produce visible progress, and prestigious enough to restore the one thing therapy rarely gives back quickly, which is a sense of standing. Consider what a tutor actually offers that a therapist, by design, does not. A tutor arrives with an agenda that has nothing to do with the child's inner world. There's a text to translate, a proof to solve, a piece to memorize. The child is not asked how they feel about their parents' divorce, their sister's illness, their own reflection in the mirror at 4 in the morning. They're asked to conjugate a verb correctly, and something happens in that shift that old money families have quietly understood for generations. The nervous system calms not through discussion of the wound, but through absorption in something entirely outside it. A woman who runs a boutique tutoring agency serving several of these families put it to me plainly, though she asked not to be named, the way almost everyone in this world asks not to be named. She said the families she works with don't distrust therapy exactly. They distrust the idea that talking about a problem is the same as solving it. In her words, therapy tells a child they are a person with a problem. A tutor tells a child they are a person who is becoming excellent at something, and the problem simply has less room to breathe. There's a scene that repeats itself with small variations in drawing rooms across London. A mother mentions, in the careful understatement these circles specialize in, that her son has been a bit low since boarding school started. Someone at the table, and always someone slightly older, slightly further up the family tree, suggests not a psychiatrist but a rowing coach, or a piano instructor who trained at the Royal College, someone who will demand 4 hours a week of total, punishing focus. Within a term, the mother reports, unprompted, that he seems different. Nobody in the room asks what different means exactly. They already know the shape of the answer. He seems occupied. He seems capable. He seems, in the word that matters most in these circles, composed. Composed is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it points to something old money families understand about emotional regulation that rarely gets said out loud. Composure in this world isn't the suppression of feeling, or at least that's not how it's understood internally. It's treated as a skill, the same way a serve in tennis is a skill, or perfect posture at a formal dinner is a skill. And skills, unlike feelings, can be taught, drilled, and mastered on a schedule. A therapist works on a timeline that resists prediction. A tutor works on a syllabus. This is where the story gets more complicated than it first appears, because there's a real cost to this approach, and the families who practice it aren't always blind to it. A woman who grew up inside exactly this system, Greenwich, boarding school, a rotating cast of tutors from the age of 7, described it to me as learning to be extraordinary at everything, except sitting still with an uncomfortable feeling. She could recite Latin declensions under pressure at 14. She could not, by her own account, name what she was feeling until she was nearly 30. In a therapist's office she'd finally chosen for herself, against a lifetime of quiet family skepticism. And yet, and this is the part that resists easy judgment, she also said something that stuck with me. She said the discipline itself wasn't wasted. The hours of focused, demanding practice had built something real in her, a capacity to sit with difficulty, to push through the middle of a hard task without collapsing, that she now recognizes as a form of resilience. Most of her therapist friends spend years trying to build in their clients through entirely different means. The tutoring hadn't replaced the emotional work. It had, without anyone intending it, prepared the ground for it. This is the tension sitting underneath the entire trend, and it's why calling it simply avoidance misses something important. Old money families aren't choosing tutors because they think their children have no inner lives worth attending to. They're choosing tutors because their entire cultural inheritance is built around the belief that competence restores dignity faster than conversation does. And dignity, in this world, is not a small thing. It's closer to oxygen. A child who feels incompetent at something visible, a sport, a language, an instrument, and then becomes visibly, measurably better at it, experiences a kind of relief that a purely verbal process can take months or years to produce, if it produces it at all. There's also a quieter, more practical reason behind the shift that almost nobody says aloud, but everyone in these circles understands instinctively. A tutor is discreet in a way a therapist's presence in a child's life rarely is. Car services, school pickup lists, the casual mention of who's coming by the house this week, all of it moves more easily under the heading of academics than under the heading of mental health, which still carries, in certain older families, a residue of shame that hasn't fully dissolved no matter how modern the rest of the household appears. A Mandarin tutor arriving twice a week raises no eyebrows at the country club. A therapist's name in the same slot on the calendar raises exactly the kind of questions these families have spent generations learning to avoid. If you want to understand how these families build that kind of composure so deliberately, the specific habits of reading a room, holding a silence, and projecting calm even when nothing inside feels calm, there's a guide I put together on exactly this. Walking through the mechanics of social intelligence the way old money households actually teach it, not the way it gets flattened into advice columns. It's called Social Intelligence, and I'll leave the link in the description for anyone who wants to go deeper. What almost nobody in these families will say directly, but what becomes clear the longer you spend inside their world, is that the tutor was never really about the subject being taught. The Latin, the piano, the chess opening, memorized until it's reflex. All of it is scaffolding for something else entirely. Something closer to a controlled experience of struggle and mastery in miniature, rehearsed over and over until the nervous system learns what it feels like to face something hard and come out the other side intact. Whether that's a substitute for therapy or a strange, unintentional form of it depends entirely on who you ask. The families living inside this system have never fully agreed on the answer among themselves, and that disagreement rarely surfaces at dinner tables or in the careful, understated conversations that pass for candor in these circles. It surfaces instead in the choices made quietly, one household at a time, often without the two generations in the same family even realizing they've landed on opposite conclusions. Take a father in his 60s, the kind who inherited both a fortune and a particular philosophy about how a person becomes formidable. He'll tell you if you catch him in the right mood after dinner that he was never once taken to see anyone about his feelings as a boy, and he considers this an asset rather than a deprivation. He was given a fencing master instead, and later a tutor in classical rhetoric, and he credits both with teaching him something he insists no therapist could have taught him at 12 years old, namely how to perform under pressure without visible cracking. He says this with total conviction. He also, if the conversation goes on long enough, mentions almost in passing that he didn't cry at his own father's funeral and doesn't entirely know why and has never really examined it, and changes the subject before anyone can ask him to. His daughter, watching her own children now, has made a different calculation, though she'd never frame it as a rejection of how she was raised. She keeps the tutors with the rigor, the mastery, the packed afternoon schedule that leaves no room for idle unraveling. But she's quietly added something her father's generation would have found unnecessary. A therapist seen every other week, framed to the children not as treatment, but as something closer to training. A place where they learn to name what's happening internally the same way their Mandarin tutor teaches them to name a character on a page. She's careful about how she describes it to her own mother, who still asks, every so often, whether the children are all right, in a tone that makes clear she'd prefer the answer to require no further explanation. What's emerging in households like hers isn't a wholesale rejection of the old model, and it isn't a full embrace of the new one either. It's a kind of hybrid, still being negotiated in real time, where mastery and introspection are no longer treated as competing forces, but as two instruments meant to be played together. However awkwardly the combination sits with grandparents watching from the next room. The tutor builds the composure, The therapist, when present at all, is folded quietly into the schedule with the same discretion once reserved for anything considered slightly embarrassing. Mentioned, if at all, in the same breath as the orthodontist. Never elevated to the seriousness it would carry in a different kind of household. And there's something almost poetic in how this generational shift is unfolding, without ever being named directly, because naming it would require an admission that the old approach had gaps. And admitting gaps in a culture built so thoroughly around the appearance of seamlessness is its own kind of transgression. So instead, the shift happens through small, deniable adjustments. A therapist's appointment gets described as an hour with someone who helps him focus. A difficult year gets summarized at the holiday table as he's been working with a wonderful woman. No clarification offered, none required, with ambiguity doing exactly the protective work it's meant to do. Meanwhile, the tutors themselves have started noticing something they didn't expect, and it complicates the entire picture further. Several of the ones I spoke with, the ones trusted enough to work inside these homes for years at a stretch, watching children grow from 8 to 18 under their instruction, say they've become something closer to confidants than instructors, whether they intended to or not. A child who won't say a word to a parent about what's actually wrong will sometimes say it to the man who's been teaching him ancient Greek every Tuesday for 6 years, precisely because the relationship isn't built around extracting feelings. It's built around something else, something with lower stakes and no clinical framing, and it's inside that lower stakes space that the real disclosures sometimes happen, almost by accident, in the middle of a sentence about a verb tense. One tutor, who has worked with the same family for over a decade, described a moment that seems to capture the entire phenomenon in miniature. A 15-year-old boy, mid-lesson, stopped translating and said, without any lead-up, that he didn't think his parents actually liked each other very much. The tutor didn't reach for a clinical response because he wasn't equipped for one and didn't pretend otherwise. He simply let the silence sit for a moment, said something brief and human about how that sounds hard, and then gently returned to the text. The boy finished the lesson. Nothing was resolved in any formal sense, but something had been said out loud, in a room that didn't feel like it belonged to a diagnosis, and the boy came back the following week and the week after that, and kept coming back for 3 more years. This is perhaps the real explanation underneath everything. Not that old money families believe struggle should be ignored, but that they've built, almost by inheritance, an entire infrastructure of relationships that absorb emotional weight sideways rather than head-on, through tutors and coaches and the particular kind of adult who occupies a child's life without ever officially being told they're doing anything more than teaching a subject. It's inefficient by clinical standards. It would make almost any therapist wince. And yet it has produced generation after generation people who can walk into a room full of strangers and appear entirely at ease, who can absorb devastating news at a board meeting without their expression shifting, who can bury a parent on a Tuesday and host a dinner on a Friday. And the question that nobody in these families has fully answered yet, the one that sits underneath every tutor's car pulling up the driveway and every therapist's name left carefully out of conversation, is whether that composure is something worth